Hey guys, so I'm back with another science breakdown, and today I want to go over two studies, and both of these are covering the comparison of resistance training or different parts of resistance training to static stretching. I know that as a karate practitioner, I hear very often or see very often people who push this idea of stretching before going to do your regular training. I was actually involved in a training at one point where the person was supposed to be presenting science and they were saying, oh, we need to stretch the same way they did in the 70s and 80s. There's been a lot of research since then that says otherwise, so this is going to kind of cover some of that. Both of these studies define flexibility as the ability to allow a muscle to lengthen and take a joint through a full range of motion. And then being inflexible has to do with a decrease in the ability of a muscle to actually perform and take that joint through a full range of motion. So obviously we've seen that in muscle-bound guys in karate, or you guys might have seen that in other athletes, in people who run or jump or whatever. Sometimes things get a little bit tight, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's correlated with injury. That's something that's also discussed in these studies. So first study is from 2011, and their goal was to determine how full range resistance training affected the ability, flexibility, and strength compared to static stretching in the same muscles and joints. So they were trying to make two comparable programs of resistance training and static stretching to see how they affected different people and how they affected the range of motion. And let's see here. So they started with actually three groups. They had a resistance training group, a static stretching group, and a control group. And they took all of them through their through some basic range of motion tests using a goniometer. So they did knee extension flexibility, where they had them lay on their back, bring their knee up, extend their leg toward the ceiling. They measured the angle of their knee. They did hip extension, where they laid on their stomach, lifted their leg. Shoulder flexibility, where they actually held a dowel and lifted their arms up, which I don't understand why the other tests were passive and this one was active, but that's kind of beside the point. And they also did some strength tests as well, because they also wanted to see how the strength was affected by resistance training versus static stretching. So they did that for all three groups, and then they had a 5-week program that was designed by the same strength and conditioning specialist. So the 5-week strength program was legit, because it covered all kinds of different stuff. I don't know if you can actually see this here, but that is actually, probably can't read that at all. That is a strength training program. They did a lot of really great full range of motion, multi-joint movements, chin-ups, whatever. This is supposed to be, they did make the comment that this was supposed to be for beginners, but most beginners can't do chin-ups, so I don't know how that worked out. But they did chin-ups, walking lunges, squats, bench press, dumbbell bench press, which is a fuller range of motion. A lot of really great full range of motion stuff. But then they did the stretching variations, which there was not a lot of variation. There wasn't a lot of volume. There were some super basic stretches. Personally, I had some issue with the way they did the stretching program, because they definitely could have done a better job at stretching each of the joints a little bit, I guess, more well-rounded, or actually stretching the same joints. I felt like there was a lot that was missed, but I digress. They did do, they had their stretching program, their strength training program, and then after 5 weeks, everybody was retested, and what they found, see where we are here, got all of that. They found that there were no significant differences between either groups, between the two training groups. So the control group didn't really have any improvement or anything, but the improvement in the strength training group and the static stretching group, there were improvements, but there weren't a lot of differences between them. So they found that they were about the same. They felt like it was that this study was limited just because it wasn't very long. It was only 5 weeks. But then something they talked about at the end is this idea of PNF stretching, which is something that's done on occasion, where you actually take a joint through a full range of motion as you can get to. You do a contraction and then you let it go. They did talk about how they thought that was maybe a better alternative to static stretching. And then they talked about also this muddled jargon of dynamic warm-up versus dynamic stretching, which one is which. It's kind of confusing, but basically they were saying that they didn't feel that static stretching was going to be, they really were, I feel like they were kind of biased, but they did feel like resistance training overall was kind of better for getting full range of motion, but they did say that there wasn't really a lot of a difference. They said that the results of the study suggest that resistance training, so long as it is done over an appropriate full range of motion, will have positive effects on flexibility. And their goal there was to say that people who say that people who lift weights are muscle bound and are really limited in range of motion is not true, and that they're correct. That's not true at all. Just because you lift weights does not mean you become muscle bound and you can't move. It just depends on the range of motion that you use, and they showed that in that study, even though it was a little bit limited. So the other study that I thought was really interesting, they had a lot of great background, but it was a little bit limited as far as its application. So this one is a comparison of the immediate effects of eccentric training versus static stretch on hamstring flexibility in high school and college athletes. So they were doing a one-time deal. This was not over a long period of time. They just basically met with these guys, tested them, did a quick test, retested. So super simple and straightforward, but they had a lot of great background information, and they were only looking at hamstring flexibility. So they were saying that although the hamstring muscle is the most frequently stretched muscle, if you see anybody stretching, they're probably stretching their hamstrings. They were saying that despite the fact that this is the most frequently stretched muscle, it's also the most commonly strained, which is makes you think, maybe stretching doesn't actually prevent injury, because it doesn't. No one has shown that it does. Let's see here. What they did is they felt like they were saying that a lot of coaches will use flexibility, static stretching, flexibility training in a warm-up, because they feel that kind of flexibility training is good to get full range of motion, whatever. But the problem is that it doesn't actually warm the muscle. It doesn't get them ready for sport. So they felt that eccentric training would decrease injury rates because it warms up a muscle, and it actually gets the body prepared for activity, which is something that you see in activity. If you have an injury, usually happens in the eccentric portion of a movement, which is usually where there's a contraction and a lengthening. If you were doing a bicep curl, the concentric is this lifting portion, the eccentric is the lowering. You have that kind of lowering thing happen all the time in athletic movement, and that's usually when injuries occur. The muscles are going like this while you're trying to contract, something tears, that's the kind of thing that happens. So they were hoping that this would actually help with not only increasing flexibility, but also kind of strengthening things up and preventing some injury, but that's not what the point of the study was. They just mentioned it a few times. So they started with 87 subjects. They ended up with 75 because everybody had to be limited in their range of motion. It had to be no injuries to the hip, knee, thigh, or low back. They had to show hamstring tightness, and they had to be between 15 and 21 years old. And then they did the same hip flexion test as the previous study, where they laid on their back, lifted their knee up to about 90 degrees, and then they had to extend their knee. And they basically measured that range of motion there to see how mobile they were. And then they had 3 different groups. So they had a static stretching group, a eccentric sort of group, and then a control group, just to see what the differences were. So basically the static stretching group just stood up, put their leg up onto a chair and stretched. And then they stretched for 30 seconds. That was pretty much it, and they got retested. The eccentric group did this kind of strange exercise where they lifted their leg up and had to lift as high as they could, and they had to do they decided that as high as that was the full range of motion. So then they would lower back down, and then they would have to actually resist the movement. So they'd be pulling themselves, and they would have to be resisting with their own hamstrings as they pulled that leg back. So they considered it an eccentric contraction. I think it's a little kind of strange because you're pulling it yourself. I think it would have been better if it was somebody else, but once again, I digress. They were doing the best they could. They had to do it in one go round. So they did finally find that the eccentric group, this group right here, they actually had the most increase in flexibility in that moment. So it was a very short study. You got tested, you did your thing that they wanted you to do, whether it was static stretching, nothing, or the eccentric stuff. They retested you again to see if you had improvements. They said that the only group, the static stretching and the eccentric group had improvements, but the eccentric group was the best. So they were mentioning at the end, the goal for clinicians and patients is a restoration of normal function functional motion. So normal motion requires the patient to have the flexibility and the strength to perform movement. Strengthening through a full range of motion is essentially what they were going for. So they were making the same point as the previous study, that you really should have strength through a full range of motion, and that's going to be what not only increases your flexibility, but your mobility, your ability to actually use a joint through a full range of motion rather than it just be passively moved through, which is probably going to help in preventing injury. And they kind of harped on that quite a bit. So both studies were pretty much saying that resistance training was probably superior to static stretching. And what absolutely kills me is that this study is from 2006 and this one was from 2011. And it is now 2019 and people still think that static stretching is the end all be all. Even though there are benefits to it, I don't think that it's going to be the best thing for a warm up, especially for an active athlete, especially if you're about to perform or you're about to compete, which that's been shown multiple times since then. But I digress once again. That's just a little bit of science for you guys in case you aren't familiar with some of the scientific background. This is some stuff that's been out for now about 13 years, between 13 and 8 years. So yeah, there's a start to it. So if you need some more questions answered about static stretching, let me know and maybe we can dig up some more science about it.